Hello, I'm Don Corrion, and today we're going to leverage the new custom reports feature to learn about heads-up flop strategies. So what are we going to be covering? We are going to become a flop chameleon. Okay, we're going to learn about many different stack sizes, spots, configurations in a broad sense in order for us to have a better general sense of how to adjust to new situations, strange situations, new formats, like in this case, for a lot of people, heads up. We're going to learn how to crush our opponent's heads up, especially when you're, for example, trying to hold the lobby, right? Nowadays, even in a site like WPT Global, where the system is made so that even at lower stakes, you kind of have to play some heads up. I've heard that at 200 NL, sometimes you're forced a little bit to play heads up. So when two regs are mostly 6-max regs, and one of them knows some heads up, there's definitely going to be a huge edge to be had there. We're going to learn about how do ranges work, right? Like how do magnets work, how to build a flop strategy in terms of sizing, frequency, and where does that come from in terms of what do the ranges do to make a strategy look like it does. And we are going to learn to adapt to different stack lists, as I said. So we're going to inspire fear at the tables, and we're going to take on the whole lobby. So to begin with, I'm going to demonstrate how it works. So to run one of these reports, we would have to go to custom reports here. You see, I've created a bunch of them already. We're going to be using all of these in this presentation. You see, I've named some, so you can change the name. You can order by date. You can do a bunch of stuff like that, but let's demonstrate how to actually do it. So to run our custom report for heads up, we would have to go to the actual heads up range that we want to be using. So 100 blinds deep, chip EV, general. I mean, chip EV, it depends if you want to run for your rake, if it's 100 NL, 200 NL, 500 NL, whatever it is. We have to change that. What sizing you want to play? You want limps? No limps. I would generally recommend, if you're new to heads up, not limping at the 100 big loss deep anyway. But yeah, click on confirm, and we would set up, in this case, a single raise spot. Let's just start with that to start with the examples. And you have this AI page opened up. If you have used the AI solver, you would already be quite familiar with this. I'll briefly explain a few things like the ranges, the rake, the pot and the stack, whether it's chip EV, ICM. And then the most important part is that you understand how this works, right? You have 3 bet types: automatic, dynamic, and fixed. Automatic is basically a one sizing strategy per flop, where the sizing is chosen by, let's say, GTO Wizard default sizes, right? So GTO Wizard has, like, I'm not sure which ones they are, but let's say it's like quarter pot, 40%, 2/3, something like this. There are 3 bet types. There's automatic, dynamic, and fixed. Automatic is one size per flop, and which sizing it is going to be chosen by GTO Wizard. Fixed is whatever amount of sizes that you input here, and it's going to be all of them, right? So all the flops are going to be are going to have all of the sizings that you input here. And dynamic, which is what I generally recommend, allows you to have a few different bet sizes, right? So you can have 1 or 2 and always add all in, and you can specify which ones they are, right? So it's going to be, in this case, one sizing strategy per flop, but it's going to have the sizings that you want, right? So let's say 35, 50, and 100. So it's going to choose one sizing per flop out of these 3 choices. We can do the same for raise sizes, give a few, and we can give a few re-raise sizes as well. So we would click create report. It would cost a certain amount of credits, and it would take a few minutes to run. So while it's running, in the meantime, we are going to actually go back and look at pre-flop ranges to get our feet wet in heads up. So let's go to this. So as we can see, heads up RFI range is extremely wide. That's nothing new. The interesting thing, though, that we have to keep in mind as we go to the reports and as we look at single raise spots specifically, is the fact that different to 6-max, the big blind defense is actually not as weak, but it has not as weak hands as the small blind. And the reason is because we're being laid worse odds than in 6-max, right? There's no additional 0.5 blinds in the pot from the small blind. It's just the 2.5 on our blind. And so we have worse. And therefore, our range is actually going to be a little bit tighter relative to how wide the RFI is. So it's not that the range is tighter itself, it's that it's tighter relative to the small one. Okay. We can see that it's a kind of a polar 3-bet from 2%. There's some mixed up offsuit hands and suited hands. This is very resembling of a 6-max range, except wider and weaker, of course. And then we have, of course, pretty wide defense and a fairly intuitive morphology for a 4-bet, which is test plus, and then a very, very polar set of bluffs. Okay, so let's see how the reports are doing. Yeah, it seems like it's not done, but it's okay. We can still go to, yeah, it's about half of the way, but we can still go to the one that I already made, which I called heads up single spot 100, and that way we move on. We have all the flops right here. Let's start with the first point that is quite interesting, which is donks, right? There are not a lot of donks in heads up. Even if we order by boards with the most donks, let's do that. We see that even the boards with the most donks have a relatively small amount of donks, right? Why is that? Well, the reason is because even though the RFI range is relatively weak, that comes with a little benefit, right? Having a weak range comes with a little benefit, which is extremely good board coverage, right? The imposition range is never going to be amazing, but it's also never going to be terrible. Therefore, donking is not developed a lot on a lot of boards. We see that surprisingly, yes, there are the low connected boards, but there's also these paired deuces and paired sevens and stuff like that comes from the exact shape of the 3-bets and what the gaps are in each range. But yeah, the biggest difference is that there's not as much donking as in 6-max. So let's go to the C-bet strategy. And we're going to try to look at different features of the reports so that you guys can learn how to use it. So the first thing that I would look at is whether you prefer this view, the chart view, or the table view. I prefer the table view. I'm a Excel enthusiast, so I've used a lot of Excel, so this kind of looks more intuitive to me. But if you prefer this, then by all means. You have filters, right? You can filter for highest card, ace, open-enders possible, paired, etc. And you can even save the filters. So let's say, for example, we want to filter for disconnected ace high boards, and we could save that filter, right? So that could be one filter that we look at. And the thing I like to use the most is this little menu where you can look at all flops, like we're looking at right now, but you can also look at categories like high cards, suits, pairing, connectedness. This I really, really like to use. So we're going to be using that. Well, first of all, let's understand what these rows mean, right? Blind versus blind. I mean, it's heads out, so yeah. This is the overall breakdown across all of the flops, of course, right? And this is the ones that you have filtered right now. So because we don't have any filter at the moment, these two rows are the same. And then you start with the actual flops. You have the EV of both positions, in position and out of position EV. You have the equity of both positions, and you have the equity realization. So so this is a quite nice view to see who has range advantage and why and such. You can even change how this looks if you want. There's multiple ways to view it. So you have chart, which is the color is only in the graph. We have text, just there's no graph. We have background. It gives the background a little bit of color. I do like chart. For some reason, this is my favorite. So let's stick with that. Yeah, let's use these categories to try to learn something about heads up poker. So let's go to high cards, and we are sorting by high card. We can already see a few patterns, right? Like this pot size is increasing towards the bottom, right? And actually, let me correctly order by high card so that we have proper order. Yeah, this pot size is increasing towards the bottom. Now, in these super, super low boards, there's less pot size. And the reason is because when you have a 5 high board or a 4 high board, it's guaranteed basically to be connected or paired, right? And so once the board gets connected and paired, the sizings are going to not go as big for equity switching reasons, right? When you have an overpair on a connected board, you don't want to isolate yourself against hands that are going to draw very well against you. You want your opponent to stay in the pot with hands that are still somewhat dominated, right? We have the deuce high board, which is exactly trip deuces. So that's why, I mean, it's literally 0% of boards. So we're not going to pay much attention to it. But it's interesting to think about why it's a pot or check strategy. Well, if you think about the things we talked about pre-flop, it makes complete sense that it would be a pot or check strategy. We said that it is actually a weaker range, or at least the bottom of the range is weaker than the big blind, right? And therefore, it's almost like if you had a polar range. You have a range where you want to leverage over pairs and hands like ace king, and you have a lot of air that is worse than big blind's air. That leads to a polar strategy. But let's go back to the actual meat of this, just this idea where on high boards, there's smaller sizes, and the pot size is the most present on disconnected low to medium boards. And we see that the half pot is also increasing towards the bottom. So that's already a pattern that we can implement. I would recommend that when you start studying a certain spot, you don't go into it trying to learn every single flop individually, right? You can do that later if you want. To begin with, just get the patterns, get the trends, right? And then if you see yourself playing a certain spot wrong, then go into it and figure it out specifically. But having this more wide view will help you have a better overall strategy. So we see a certain correlation between board height and size. So to suits, we see that monotone, basically only using small, and then there is a certain correlation with the board being flush draw or rainbow. Rainbow is higher frequency and smaller sizing. Flush draw is lower frequency and bigger sizing, but you see the difference is quite small regardless. We can go to pairing, and we can see that paired boards are, of course, choosing small size for the most part. Triple are actually half pot boards, and not paired have the most wide array of different sizes. And connectedness, this is a pretty interesting one. We're going to try to think about why. We have connected, open-ender is possible, and disconnected. And we see a clear correlation between how big you go and how connected it is, right? The reason why this is the case is because, for example, on a board like ace 7-3 rainbow, which would count as very disconnected, even though actually there is an open-ender possible, or right, there's 5-4 possible, which is a pretty strong draw. But, for the most part, it's a pretty disconnected flop. A hand like a 3, right, like a jack 3, would benefit a lot from folding out hands like queen 9, right? Folding out this with this is really good, right? This is what happens in high boards where your low pairs can get a lot of protection with small sizes, right? You can bet a small size and get a fold from a hand with a decent amount of equity, which doesn't necessarily happen on more connected and wet boards. So let's think, for example, of a board like 8-7-3 two-tone, and you have the same hand, you have jack 3, you may think, I mean, it's pretty similar, right? You have a bottom pair. In fact, now you're not going to run into an ace. So you could even say, oh, now it's a stronger hand. It is a stronger hand on this board than the previous one, but it is a hand that doesn't really benefit from betting small, right? Because now a hand like queen 9 is 2 overcards. And when you bet small, a lot of these combos, especially when they have a backdoor flush draw or something like that, if you bet too small, they're not going to fold, right? This is why the board height affects your sizing, is because, marginal hands have less and less and less of an incentive to bet small on lower boards, whereas good hands, like a hand like tens here, benefits a lot from folding king jack, right? Which is a hand that would never fold versus small sizing. right? So you see the way the equities are distributed and the hands that you are dominated or being dominated by when it comes to you having strong value or marginal value affects the size, right? So the more connected, the less of an incentive you have to bet with that bottom pair, and the more of an incentive you have to bet bigger with good value. So we can go back to flops and we can check a few different examples. So let's order by different frequencies and see if we see the pattern of which boards are using a certain sizing or a certain frequency more often. So let's start with the small bet. We're going to see what are the range bet boards. And what you can see in this left side graph, which is basically the totality of all of the flops stacked on top of each other, right? You see that there's almost no range bets. There's only this area that you could kind of like consider pretty much a range bet, right? So there's not that many range bet, which comes from the fact that the RFI range heads up is YY. It's the same as what we talked about in the deuce, deuce, deuce board, right? But we do see a pattern for which boards are really good. It's basically double Broadway, fairly disconnected or dry boards, and also very good paired boards, right? So double Broadway, disconnected, and paired boards. Those are basically the only types of boards where you will ever find a range bet in heads up. There are some of these like Jack 9-5, which are pretty disconnected and fairly good, which are close to a range bet, but not quite. Arguably, you could still range bet those. But yes, as soon as you move down to a board like even King 8 Deuce Rainbow, it's not range betting anymore. King 7-4 two-tone, it's not range betting anymore. Boards like Ace 6-4 two-tone, not range betting anymore, right? As soon as you get into not the best of the best boards, they become more of a mid to high frequency C-bets. So that's something to keep in mind. Same goes for paired boards, right? As soon as you go to a paired board, like even King 4, it's already not a range bet, right? 9-8-8, 8-6-6, not range bet. So let's go and look at the half pot. And we see there are a few half range bet, which are exactly the trip boards. And the reason is, your advantage here is so vast that you can get away with both a range bet and a big size, which is not very common. But as soon as we move down ever so slightly, we get to the actual meat and potatoes of flops, right? The majority of flops that you're going to encounter is this kind of run-of-the-mill Jack 4 deuce, 10-6-4, right? Queen 5-3, 10-6-5. All of these kind of a high card, kind of wet, but not super wet, right? These are very, very common flops that you're going to encounter. And these are played as a mid to high frequency for a middling size. And the reason is, again, what we've talked about, where as you go down in board height, the equity that you need to deny changes with different sorts of value. And our range is not that strong as imposition, so we don't get to just range bet mindlessly across all boards. Okay, let's look at pot size, and we see our beloved deuce, deuce, deuce. And then what we will see is triple Broadway, kind of lowish, mid-low boards, and also there should be a couple two Broadway boards that are not quite connected, or even something like this, like a Jack 9-5 two-tone. That is a very, very, very wet board, right? 10-8-5, 9-5 deuce. Boards like that where you have to play wide polar. So one of the mistakes that newer players make to heads up is playing two mergy strategies on flop. Okay, they don't look exactly like six max. Some of them look similar, right? But it's not the same. For example, these pot or check strategies on King Jack 10. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Why? Well, because in heads up, most Broadways 3-bet pre-flop, right? There's no there's none of this like King Queen offsuit calls and these sorts of things. Most two Broadway hands for the big one are 3-betting. So he's actually extremely capped. But again, his middle of range is actually quite strong. He's going to have a lot of second pairs, a lot of third pairs, while we're going to have more air potential. So that lends itself to a polar strategy. Okay. Now let's look at the checks and see what boards are higher frequency and lower frequency, just to get a sense for it. And we see immediately at the lowest frequency boards, we see high monotone boards, usually 2 or 3 high cards and monotone. Right? Why is that? Well, it's really simple. First of all, on a monotone board, in the first place, you don't have as much of an incentive to bet with marginal hands, because the equities are going to switch later, and even with thin value, even with hands that are like, for example, with a top pair, a second pair, the board is going to change and your equities are going to change so much that there's not as high of an incentive to bet with those hands, because you end up isolating yourself against hands that draw well against you. And you, for example, if you bet a king, you end up just folding out a bunch of undercards to your king, right? So it's not that you wouldn't bet any king on like a king high board, but there's definitely a lower incentive for that. And also, on these kinds of boards, we don't have as many flushes as the big blind, right? Like the big blind is going to be three betting a lot of the ace X and king X suited pre-flop. And so they actually have more suited hands that are lower, whereas our suited hands, yes, we do have lower ones, but a lot of our pre-flop suited hands were those Broadway hands. Okay, so that's some food for thought, definitely. And then, as we already saw, the range bets are just really, really, really good boards for in position. Okay, so let's briefly look at races. So we see there are, well, I chose 3 sizes: pot, 3/4, and half pot. And we see there's a wide, even distribution of them. And we can see with this kind of method what those look like. So you see a few things. The frequency of races is increasing towards the lower boards. Now, why is that? Well, the lower the board, the higher incentive to check raise the flop with, say, a top pair, a second pair for a small side, right? You deny more equity from overcards, your second pairs would be stronger on a low board, right? So you have more of an incentive to take these equity denial lines on lower board. Whereas on a higher board, like an ace high board, king high board, you see the pot size being used quite a bit. And the reason is you don't have almost any incentive to check raise very thin for value. So you end up check raising quite polar and quite big, right? So low frequency, big size versus higher frequency, small size. That's definitely a very common pattern, even for six mans. Suitedness, the more rainbow, the bigger the size. And this is kind of, maybe it would seem unintuitive, but the thing is, especially out of position on a high SPR, things work differently than in position, where you really, when you take aggressive lines on flop, especially out of position on a high SPR, you really need to be careful about what the runouts are going to look like, right? On a monotone board, the runouts are going to be a nightmare, right? If you check raise, for example, with a flush, there's going to be board pairing, there's going to be four flush, there's going to be all kinds of runouts that really are difficult to navigate. And so not bloating the pot right away helps you navigate those more easily. Flush draw, kind of a similar idea, but goes more into the 75% sizing, where there's still some turns that are difficult to navigate. So we don't want to isolate ourselves against hands that draw really, really well against us. Whereas on the rainbow, we basically are just going geometric almost, right? We're just saying we have a good hand, or we have air, and we are going to put our whole stack in. That's kind of what we are saying when we raise flop on a super dry board. So that's another pattern that we see there. Pairing, pretty intuitive pattern here. On a paired boards, you have more of an incentive to raise with one pair hands to deny equity, and then on triple, same thing. And connectedness, we see kind of an interesting pattern where on the connected boards, we see the 75% size being used the most, And as they get more and more disconnected, it starts using the other two sizings. Right? So on the disconnected, there's going to be boards where we raise half pot. And remember that all of these, even though we're seeing multiple sizes, every single individual board is a one sizing strategy. Okay. Every individual board is a one sizing strategy. So the fact that these are mixed means that there's some boards where we're doing half pot and some boards where we're doing pot. Right? So that's kind of like the idea for disconnected boards, is that there can be some where we raise really thin for equity denial and some where we go really polar for stacks. And as they get more and more and more connected, we are raising more with good hands that at the same time don't want to run into issues on future streets. So we learned some stuff about heads up in single raise pots. Size depends on board height and connectivity. Frequency depends on size, where you're not going to range bet when your sizing is pot. So depending on the size, that already affects your frequency and the range advantage. Right. So usually the range bets are going to be, of course, small sizes. And whenever you choose a big size, it's going to be a lower frequency that depends on your range advantage. There are very, very few range bets because of this, let's say, symmetry. There's less of an asymmetry as, for example, if viewers play 6-max and it's UTG versus big blind, the asymmetry is so extreme that UTG is going to hit really, 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 really well on most boards, but whiff completely on some, right? Picture 6-max UTG versus big blind. Picture a board like, I don't know, Jack 9-5, where UTG is just golden. And picture a board like 5-4-3 two-tone, where UTG is really suffering, right? In heads up, this is not the case. The RFI range is hitting all boards quite decently, but it rarely hits very, 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 very well. There are very few don'ts for the same reason. These two are basically two sides of the same coin. You will see in a lot of configurations, the configurations where you see the most don'ts are also the configurations where you see the most range bets. So for example, 6-max UTG versus big blind. There's going to be more donks on flop than bottom versus big blind, but also more range bets for imposition. Right? It's a more all or nothing type of thing because of the lack of board coverage. Okay, so let's look at a few other configurations before moving on. So we're going to look at 3-bet pots that I already run, and we can do kind of the same sort of thing. We can sort by high cards. And what I did for these is I gave it 3 sizes for c-bet again, 25, 50, and 100. And you see that the pot size is actually surprisingly often the preferred size. In fact, and this is something that a newer player to heads up might not realize, on even on ace high boards, it's a really common size. And remember, the fact that you see this doesn't mean that on ace high boards you use this split. It means that there's this percentage, which is 15% of ace high boards, pot or check as the highest one sizing strategy. Okay, very important to understand. So there's a lot of these high boards where you are supposed to play pretty much pot or check. Okay, not even half pot. Okay? We see this pattern, very, very clear pattern, where the half pot is increasing towards the bottom. Right? The half pot sizing is increasing towards the bottom. This is the sizing of betting ace king for value and equity denial, of betting second pairs for equity denial, stuff like that. Whereas the pot size is the really polar strategy where we are leveraging our top pair, top kicker, top advantage. So we're going to see how that looks a little bit later. Let's see. Suits, pretty interesting that flush draw boards are played more for a pot size than rainbow boards. And you might again think, okay, this contradicts what we just saw in single raise spots where rainbow boards were picking a bigger sizing. All of this seems random. There seems like there's no rhyme or reason to this. There is a very, very clear reason behind it. So in this case, the reason it's different and why flush draw boards are potting a lot more than rainbow boards, even out of position, is because the sizing is so big that it allows you to go all in on the turn if the runout gets ugly, right? If the SPR is really, really, really big and you bet really big on flop, you end up having a lot of difficulties realizing your equity on some rounds, right? But once the SPR is low, that problem doesn't exist. You can just bet a really big percentage of your stack on flop, and then if things get ugly, you can decide to not see a river, right? So that's why the difference is there. It's due to the SPR. If we were to increase the SPR enough, this pattern would definitely change, right? If we increase the SPR to, I don't know, 500 big ones deep or something, we would probably see flush draw boards not being played as liberally as this. You will see when we look at 200 blinds deep that the solver finds a pretty creative solution to the problem, right? 200 big blinds deep, we are going to have an issue of SPR when it comes to using big sizing, and the solver is going to find quite a creative way to fix that. Paired boards, so paired and triple, mostly half pot, right? Basically, our leverage in these paired boards is hands like nines, eights, right? Usually over pairs to the board, right? Like tens on a 9-9-5 board that just want to start betting and denying equity and such. Whereas not paired are the most, it changes a lot from one board to another, what strategy you're going to play. And connectedness, there's not like a super, super strong correlation, but there is one. You can see that the more connected, the more of the pot size we're using. Again, this pot size is designed to actually save us from difficult runouts because of the low SPR. Because of the low SPR, we can use the big sizing now to save ourselves from difficult runouts by lowering the SPR to 1 on the turn, right? That would not be something we can do on a very, very, very high SPR. And we see higher frequency and smaller sizing on disconnect. So far, so good. We can go to the actual flops and we can do the same thing where we look at different strategies. So we see that the range bet, high frequency, small bet is going to be ace high boards, king high boards, high paired boards, right? The usual suspects. Right? But you will see that once again, as soon as you go down a little bit, it stops being a range bet quite quickly once you get to boards like queen 7 deuce and stuff like that, queen 7 4, even king 6 deuce. And the reason is because our 3-bet range is quite polar, and we on most boards we don't actually have this overwhelming advantage. Like if we had a more linear range, let's look at the half pot. So we see triple, trip boards, paired boards, and we're gonna see again a lot of the bread and butter boards like queen 8-3, right? For example, where we play, it's somewhat connected, queen 7-4, queen 7 deuce, 10-8-3, 10-7-5, jack 8-6. A lot of these half pot or check strategies are going to be present. So that is definitely intuitive. This is the most interesting, probably. It's the pot size strategies. Okay, so we see the pot size again happening on the triple Broadway, specifically in Queen Jack 10, because Ace King, right? You have Ace King exclusivity. But, and also we see this pot size on like super low boards like this, which is kind of intuitive. If you've studied 6-max, these big sizings on these low boards definitely should be somewhat intuitive. But the ones that are a little bit less intuitive is a board like Ace 10-8, maybe. A board like Ace 10-8, a board like Ace 10-9, Ace 10-6. These are the ones that when we were categorizing by flop height, we saw ace high boards, king high boards, and such using pot size. It's usually going to be 2 Broadway, decently disconnected flops, although more so if they are two-tone, right? So not fully connected, but somewhat wet, and double Broadway. Why? Well, let's think about why. Their in-position player, in this case, pre-flop, has such a wide range defending pre-flop that he's going to have all of the offsuit Broadways. Okay, in position has all of the offsuit Broadways. Jack 10 off, Queen 10 off. All those hands are in the in position range. So on a board like the one we were looking at, like King 10-8 or Ace 10-8 or Ace 10-9, one of these boards, The imposition player has an immense amount of second pair and bad top pair and gut shots, right? So imposition range has a lot of gut shots, a lot of second pair, and a lot of weak pair. Now, if I ask you what sizing is good against a range of gut shots and second pairs, you wouldn't say water pot, right? That seems like a sizing that doesn't actually put pressure on that range. You would just realize his equity very, very easily, right? But once you pot, those hands become, you can actually look at it, once you pot, those hands become indifferent and some of them fall right away. So now the gotchas are put in a very, very terrible spot, and so do the second pairs. They're put in a terrible, terrible spot. That's kind of what we're going for with these huge sizings. So let's look at the frequencies again up, and we see there are some pretty much range checks, and we see it's essentially monotone boards with, again, kind of high cards blocking our flushes. Yeah, that's basically the pattern that we're seeing. Those are the worst of the worst boards, and the range bets we already looked at. Paired boards and some really, really good disconnected boards. So, okay, heads up through pots. Sizings are quite intuitive, except for the pot size, right? More pot size. In position has a lot of two Broadway, gut shots, and second pairs. A lot of range checks on some monotone boards. In position, I didn't even look at the report when it comes to this because I already knew the answer was going to be the in position stacked sizing is pretty consistent. It would be around 33-40% pot on most boards, and the frequency changes on depending on how good the board is for the imposition player. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Let's briefly look at 4-bet pots too, and this should take not a lot, but let's just for the sake of completion, because there are some interesting things. So right away, we see a few interesting ideas in these boards, which is that there are donks. Okay, is it 4-bet pots heads up? There are some dongs on some boards. In fact, quite high, almost range bet dongs on some of these boards. And on the most connected ones, we actually just see all-in dongs, right? In really, really, really connected boards, we see all-in dongs. When we look at the other side of the coin, you'll also find it interesting because there are also all-in c-bets. So you see some all-in donks on the most connected boards that really make our top pairs, like a hand like ace jack on a jack 10-7 just wants to get done with the pot already. But we see a lot of high frequency small donks, and the unintuitive thing for a lot of people is going to be that you see a lot of jack, king, queen, 10. That's a suspicious board. So jack, 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 right? Like it seems like there's a common thread, which is basically almost all boards that have don'ts contain the jack, right? And also this king, queen, 10, right? So what's happening? Well, what's happening is ace, jack offsuit, right? The out of position, specifically 100 big blinds deep, the in position player is not going to have ace jack offsuit for betting. It's too middling, right? It's not strong enough to 4-bet for value. It's not weak enough to 4-bet as a bluff. The in position player doesn't have ace jack offsuit, but the out of position player does have ace jack offsuit a very, 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 very high frequency of the time. So these boards with a jack or more like king queen 10 become quite beneficial for the caller. So that's kind of like an interesting idea about 4-bet pot sets up that most people wouldn't think about. When it comes to c-betting, let's do same process. So we see the frequency is actually increasing towards the bottom. And again, you look at different spots and you see things change, and you might, start pulling your hair and be like, everything's different, everything's crazy. High boards are high frequency, but low boards are high frequency. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that each spot is different, right? The ranges are different. In this spot, the low boards are actually kind of like no one hits anything, right? And when no one hits anything, a range of overpairs essentially vastly overperforms. Even a hand like ace king on a 7 high board is a really strong hand, right? So that's why these low boards are so good for the 4-better. While on these high boards, why are they not range betting? Why are they middling frequency. Well, we saw the Jack thing, right? The Jack X thing, but even these ones, well, our 4-bit range contains a lot of tens, of jacks that are going to be under pairs, and we are also 4-betting with the polar range, right? We're 4-betting with a polar range. Also, our sizing is quite big. We're going 25 or 26 blinds pre-flop, which is big for imposition. So we end up in a spot where the defender range pre-flop is quite decently strong, and our range is quite polar. So again, it lends itself to a more polar frequency. Now, why is it not a polar sizing, right? Why aren't we betting big and for middling frequency? Well, it just comes down to SPR, right? The SPR is so low that even if we bet quarter pot or third pot, we're well on our way to stack off, right? So we don't need to polarize to big sizing. We actually prefer to polarize to a geometric, quote unquote, geometric-ish size. And we see some of these all-in C bets start creeping in suits. So we see that those all-ins happening more on two-tone, monotone, lower frequency, very, very common thing. Pairing, the more paired, the better for the 4-better, because when no one hits anything, the guy with overpairs wins, right? And connectedness, we see the more connected, the more all-in C bets. So let's look at the flops and let's try to figure out what's going on. So we see a lot of range bets, lower boards, as we mentioned. And as soon as we get to boards like ace-9-5, ace-7 deuce, we're starting to build a checking range, right? We want to check with kings. We're going to want to check with all those kinds of hands. And some air is also going to check, right? There's not a lot of half pot, but let's look at the all-in c-bet, right? The mighty all-in c-bet for the pots. Well, it basically happens on almost very, very similar boards where the all-in dong happens, except you don't need as much connectivity, right? You can have more like 8-7 deuce, which is not nearly as connected as the boards where the dong all-in donks were happening, or even Jack 10-3. There weren't many all-in donks there. There are way more all-ins. And in fact, all-in is the main sizing on these Jack 10x boards. A lot of these like 9-8x, right? Queen 10-8, 10-9x, those sorts of boards, 10-9 deuce, 10-9-5. So that's kind of the idea. And the reason why is basically with good top pair or an overpair on a really, really good board, once the SVR is even pretty close to 1, right? It's 1.4 or something like that, the equity denial is worth a lot. Let's move on to 200 blinds already. Let's just move on to 200 blinds. And what I want to look 200 blinds deep is specifically I want to look at 3-bet pots, okay? Because single raise pots, 200 blinds deep, don't change that much because from SPR high to very high, the strategies specifically of flop are not going to be that different. But in 3-bet pots, the strategies change the most because it goes from a very low SPR to a decently sizable SPR, right? And we're going to see some creative ways the solver does, creative things the solver does. So let's go to that spot. And the main thing I want to look at is, so I gave the solver same sizes as before, 25, 50, 100, but I gave it a 2E size, which is very strange to even come up with, right? On a SPR that's still relatively low, 2xing the pot on flop. And you see that is actually a quite frequent strategy. It's as frequent as the pot size strategy. We're going to see why. We're going to see where that happens. And what we see is these happen on, these basically, honestly, it's very similar boards where we used to use pot. We're going to start using this 2x pot sizing, right? Suits, rainbow flush draw, pairing. Let's mainly just look at the flops and see which ones they are, because a lot of the strategies are not going to change that much, but this one does, right? And I was talking about how as you increase the SPR, it becomes more difficult to navigate future streets out of position, right? And your flop strategies need to reflect that. So usually, as you increase SPR out of position, you play smaller sizings on dynamic boards, actually. right? Dynamic boards out of position, high SVRs tend to go towards smaller sizings to protect yourself from those difficulties later. But here, the sort finds a quite interesting solution to the problem, which is actually going bigger so that it still achieves the same thing as it was achieving with a pot size on the previous spot, right? So ace queen six, you can start just big overbetting with ace queen, with ace king, with ace jack, and basically play very similarly as in 100 blinds deep. Obviously, the value thresholds are going to be a little bit tighter, but the main idea and approach to the spot is very similar. It's trying to punish those gut shots, trying to punish those second pairs. So a very, very similar approach. So the reason is there's more linear ranges pre-flop also. So because of the high SPR, you can't 3-bet as polar because you're going to get called more, right? When you are deep, you get 4-bet less, you get 5-bet less, you face aggression less, but you get called way more because more hands have implied odds, right? So your 3-bets, your 4-bets should be more linear. As I said, single raise spots are very, very, very similar, but it's important to remember those geometric c-bet sizes in three-bet pots. That's the biggest difference, okay? So to finish it up, we are going to look at 40 blinds deep, and I want to focus on single raised pots because those are the most interesting ones. So our RFI is going to be 2 in when we are playing 40 blinds deep, or you could open to a little bit bigger, like 2.25, but a pretty small sizing. So that causes the big blind defense to be much, much, much wider. You can actually go to the ranges and see if you just pick a random board and see that now the big blind has hands like jack deuce off, right? 6-3 off, 7-4 off, right? Because we're opening really, 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 really small. The big blind defense is extremely, extremely weak. And that is going to cause a change in overall frequency. You can see on this right hand side, the frequency of c-bet is 70, which is quite high for all boards, across all boards. And if we order by frequency, we see that there's actually a big chunk of boards that are pure range bets, whereas at 100 blinds deep, that wasn't happening almost at all, right? Like right at the beginning, it was sloping down. Right here, there's a big chunk of pure range bet boards, which would be all of the boards that in 100 blinds deep would be high frequency, right? Pretty high frequency. Here are just plain range bets, right? And even boards like we go down to something like Queen 8-3 Rainbow, it could arguably be simplified to a range bet. Even a board like 9-9 Deuce could arguably be simplified to a range bet because of how weak the big blind range is going to be, right? On the flip side, there's way more small betting. We can see when we look at this, there's way more small betting compared to other sizes, right? There's still bigger sizes like half pot, like pot, but there's way more small sizing. Why? Well, again, the weakness of the big blind range is both making our range on average stronger, and now we can also deny equity from weaker hands with our marginal hand, right? Like when our opponent has jack deuce offsuit in his range, now when we have like, I don't know, ace 5 high, denying from that becomes more interesting, right? So weaker defense range generally leads to a higher frequency, and also it can sometimes lead to small sizings being used a lot, okay? So we can see that there's still some big sizes, specifically on these sorts of boards where the small sizing doesn't make that much sense, right? But yes, there's way less faller strategies specifically on these higher boards. Suits, similar pattern as we've seen in previous scenarios, similar pattern, and a fairly similar pattern, although we see that actually, kind of interestingly, almost all disconnected boards are range betting, right? Pretty much. Almost all boards where there's not even an open-ender available are pretty much range betting. And only when you get to more drawy boards, you start building a more polar, bigger sizing and lower frequency. So very important 40 blinds deep, and we can look at the preflop ranges now. It's very important to avoid getting your equity denied unnecessarily preflop. I want to take a look at the preflop ranges now. But basically, weaker defense ranges, more range bins. And this even applies to 3-bet pots as well, because when we 3-bet 40 blinds deep, we are 3-betting quite small, right? We're either 3-betting all in or 3-betting quite small, 7, 8 blinds, which again leads to a weak defense range, which again leads to a higher frequency. So the signature move of being so short is small sizings preflop into high frequency post-flop. So let's brush it up with making sure that we understand the preflop ranges well. So we're going to look at this. So the Oakland range is very, very similar, but very, very, very important. This is crucial when playing short. Okay, this is extremely, 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 extremely crucial. You need to avoid getting your equity denied. What does that mean? Well, if you 3-bet with Queen 10 suited to 7 blinds and you get 4-bet, it's actually not a great spot to find yourself in. Same with King 9 suited, same with Queen 9 suited, King 10 suited, which are hands that would be pretty decent 3-bets at 100 blinds deep, right? They're just not at this particular SPR. So you need to avoid even hands like ace 5, ace 4, ace 3, which are very like stable, common 3-bets. You need to be careful with getting your equity denied, right? And then you could also yourself go for extreme equity denial at this SPR with low pockets. It has like ace queen, ace jack off, ace 10 off, and some bluffs like king 6 off and these low a6. Okay. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you understood how flop strategies work, how the new reports feature works. And if you got any further questions, make sure to ask in chat, and see you next time.